Coming up on this episode, a look at every single player that finished the season on the Warrior roster and whether or not they are going to remain with the franchise moving forward. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Hope everyone's having a good week. Nick Friedell of The Athletic had a really interesting article come out on Wednesday looking at every single player on the Warrior roster and giving them a percentage chance of returning to the franchise next season. So I thought that would be a good basis for me to do a similar thing and go through every single player and basically respond to Friedell's opinion with my own, whether I agree or disagree. Most of this I do agree with, but there are certainly a few here that I am kind of shaking my head at thinking I don't agree with this whatsoever. So let's go through it. We're going to go from the highest percentage down to the lowest percentage here of all the players. Starting at the top, obviously, with none other than Stephen Curry, who, according to Friedell, is a 100% chance of returning to the franchise. And I think we can all agree with that. I'm struggling to see a world in which Steph is not on the Warrior roster come opening night next season. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the world. Obviously, it would have to be him asking out of the franchise. Maybe there's some kind of disastrous offseason where the Warriors just don't put themselves into a position where Steph believes he can compete for a meaningful playoff spot and asks out. But it's Steph Curry. Like, we've got no indication that that's even a possibility. If I was him anyway, and I was concerned about where the franchise was heading, I just wouldn't sign an extension and I just enter free agency next season, and therefore I could go to the team of my choosing, which would be a disaster for the Warriors, no doubt. But in terms of Steph, and you're really trying to compete for a title, you're 38 years old, it's kind of the same situation as LeBron's in right now, is you don't want to be traded because that team is just giving up a whole heap of assets to get you. You might as well walk to a team in free agency. I think Steph's reached the point of his career where that would be the better pathway if he was considering it all leaving Golden State, which I don't think is the case whatsoever at the moment. Friedell then has Moses Moody at 99%. Slightly disagree with him being like the second most likely to remain. Now, yes, he's under contract and he's on a relatively good contract, albeit obviously this knee injury severely impacts that. I do think there's a world in which, like, if Draymond opted into his player option at $27.6 million and the Warriors are trying to get like a $40 million player, the really only other like mid-tier contract to reach that kind of mark would be Moses Moody at $12.5 million for next season. So do I think there's a 99% chance that Moses Moody remains? No, I would probably put it more so at like 90%. Like, it's very, very likely. Like, who's going to have interest in Moses Moody when, you know, we got to remember this devastating knee injury, the torn patella tendon, only happened like late March or whatever. So he's going to miss the majority of next season. What team is going to want to take him on, even though he's got a year on his contract beyond that? I would say it would have to be a young rebuilding team who are willing to take the risk of and get other assets from the Warriors obviously out of it. Again, hard to see a world in which that happens. But again, if the Warriors need a salary on top of Draymond to get like to a $40 million player or something like that, he's really the only one, barring like a Porzingis sign and trade or something, which I spoke about last episode, is incredibly unlikely to happen. He's really the only one you can utilize in that scenario. A couple of young guys here. Guy Santos is at 95%. Really unbelievable 3-year, $15 million contract, which means that contract's so valuable that you'd only trade him for like a real star player. Like, you're not going to trade that contract for another like high-end role player, because I think Guy Santos can be a high-end role player within himself. And to have that guy on a $5 million deal annually is a huge win for the Warriors. And that is a huge credit to Mike Dunleavy Jr. in the front office for getting that done during the season rather than letting Guy enter restricted free agency this offseason. So that's a massive win for the franchise, because if I was Guy now and I was heading into restricted free agency, maybe there's a team out there that offers him double that annually, like $10 to $12 million a year based on what he did over the final few months of this past season. And I think he's got a relatively good opportunity to come out early next season and make a similar mark, hopefully even improve and put up even similar numbers despite the return of Steph Curry and whatever else Golden State might do on the roster this offseason. Will Richards also at 95%. he's in a very similar boat to Gee, where like his rookie contract at like 4 years, $8 million or whatever it is just so valuable that you are trying to hold on to that. He's not as good as Gee though. So if there was like a high-end role player like available to you, like Gee, I'd kind of only trade for like a star. Will Richards, like if you could get a rotation upgrade, then I'm not going to lose sleep about giving him up, even if like the contract is really valuable. And even if he did have an impressive rookie season until he kind of hit the wall to some degree and his final couple of months weren't great, I still got optimism in him becoming a bona fide rotation player in the future. But again, unlike Gee, like the level of player that I need to get back in a trade, it certainly isn't as high for Will Richard as it is Gee Santos. There's no doubt about that. Brandon Bajemski's at 90%. This is an interesting one because there's a few different avenues in which I think pods could be traded. First of all, the most likely one, I suppose, is if the Warriors did pull off a blockbuster trade, a star-level trade where pods' value was required, then I don't think the Warriors are necessarily married to him in a way that they probably were after his rookie year when he was involved in so much of the Larry Marketing discussions. So that's the most likely avenue in which Brandon Bajemski is traded. There are a couple of others where I'm interested to see what happens with his extension eligibility after this third season, heading into his fourth year. Is there a world in which the Warriors get to, I don't know, just on the eve of the season, essentially, and they're like, what this guy wants on his contract is just so far away from what we are willing to give that we actually want to move on from him because we don't want to be paying him $20, $25 million moving forward? Would they prefer to say, let's get a cheaper guy in here, whether it's like a veteran guy on a cheaper contract than what Pods is expected to be on beyond next season? Obviously, I think his contract right now, making, what is he, like 5-6 million, whatever it is next season, that's still incredibly valuable. So having him for next season is still quite obviously important. And therefore, that's why he's sitting at 90%. But if the extension discussions are so much of an issue, maybe there's a world in which they're like, nah, we want to move on to a player who's already on a longer term deal at more affordable money than Pods is going to be on. Maybe you look at like a cheaper option, like could you trade him for a first or second year player and then have that guy on a rookie contract and kind of extend that out, have a rookie contract for a few more years rather than paying Pods? Like, question to you guys, what pick would you need in this year's draft to give up on Pods? Seriously, like that's something I'm considering. It's like, if he's asking for like $25 million a year, then I think this draft is so strong that if you could get like between like the 12th and 16th pick, if a team came down and said, here's like a 12th and between the 12th and 16th pick for Brandon Bajemski, would you do that? Because like that would be a risk because there's a good chance that player that you eventually takes never becomes better than Pods. But on the other end of the spectrum, it's like, well, maybe they actually become better than Pods and we get them on a 4-year rookie contract rather than paying him. I don't think the Warriors are going to do that. It's just something like I've thought, it's like, how could the Warriors get another first round pick in this year's draft? Because it's such a strong draft, because you're trying to set up the post-Steph future, how could you go about getting that another first round pick? And I think actually trading Pods, would he be worth a lottery pick in this year's draft? Maybe not a lottery pick, but like a pick just outside the lottery potentially, somewhere between 16 and 20. I don't know. Let me know what your thoughts are in terms of his value in a draft like this, I suppose, and what pick the Warriors could nab in this situation. And again, if we get to October and it doesn't seem like there's going to be an extension in place, maybe the Warriors decide, yep, let's move on from him now rather than going through another long restricted free agency process like we saw with Jonathan Kuminga. If I'm Pods, we know he's got the self-belief. Maybe he's willing to take the risk of restricted free agency and say, I'm going to back myself in to have a really big fourth season and make much more on a new deal than what the Warriors are offering in terms of an extension this offseason. Jimmy Butler's at 80%. Again, only a situation where there's a superstar trade in his contract is required for matching salary reasons, which it would in almost any blockbuster trade. Giannis, KD, Kawhi, whoever it is. And I still think there's a chance of that. Now, I think what Friedell's put here is a 20% chance of him being traded is actually probably about right. I don't expect it to happen, but I do think it is a possibility if the Clippers want to reset and they say, all right, here's Kawhi for Jimmy and 2 firsts. I think the Warriors would have a really long discussion and conversation about that internally. ESPN's Anthony Slater spoke to 95.7 The Game yesterday and spoke of the fact the Warriors aren't as thirsty, aren't going big game hunting in a way they might have in the past. It seems like they've resigned to the fact that Giannis Antetokounmpo is probably going to get traded, but not to them. He's probably heading to Miami or maybe Boston or staying in the Eastern Conference somewhere. They're not going to get Giannis. I don't see a world in which the Warriors pour out all their future assets this offseason. I think we've got to a point in Steph Curry's career where that was worth doing a few years ago. Now with Steph 38 going to be 39 by next year's playoffs, the Jimmy injury, Steph's own injury problems, like the Warriors, now is the time to probably have a look ahead to the future, right? We've been criticizing them for doing this over the last few years, but I think now, like, I think you'd be wasting and you'd be admitting some regret if you just gave up a bunch of picks this offseason, right? Because I think we'd look at it and say, you should have done that 3 or 4 years ago, right? When Steph was 34, 35 years old. Like, now's not the time to be doing that. You should actually be looking towards the future, which is exactly why I discussed the idea of could you try and acquire a second first round pick in this year's draft? Not trading out of the 11th overall pick, but adding to that in this year's draft. And if the Warriors are going to go star hunting and get another big name, I think it's going to be for a couple of first round picks max. Like, I don't think they're going to, again, pour out all 4 or 5 first round picks. It's going to be a couple max. I'd be surprised if they even gave up 3. Again, a Kawhi situation where it's like, all right, we want to get younger and we want to get more availability. Ironically, Kawhi gives us more availability than Jimmy Butler. And he's probably a better player than Jimmy nonetheless. He's not coming off a torn ACL. And you just give up a couple of first-round picks to flip Jimmy for Kawhi. Something like that. I don't know. Draymond Green, 70% player option. Obviously, I don't think there's a world in which he opts out of his player option and then leaves. Like, I just don't think he's going to leave the team in free agency. I think there's a 30% chance, according to Friedell, and how I would read it as there's a 30% chance he opts into his player option. And then if he does that, it probably jumps to like a 70% chance of him actually getting traded. The more likely outcome, and why is it 70% here, is that he's going to opt out and renegotiate a new deal at a significantly lower annual salary. Maybe it's something like 3 years, 45, something like 3 years, 50. Maybe it's only a 2-year deal. 2 years, 35, something like that, which would be, only $8 million more, I suppose, or $7 million more than what his player option is for this season. But I do think Draymond understands where he's at in his career. And I also think he is open enough to, if it significantly improves the roster, if you can go out and get a significant rotation piece with the kind of money that they save on a new Draymond Green deal, then I think he's actually going to be willing to do that, because he probably looks back at the amount of times he's kind of done some silly things across his career and the Warriors could have moved on from him. And if this is a way to give back to some degree, then I think he could be willing to do it and take a significant chunk off that $27.6 million player option. Al Horford, 65% chance. I know the Warriors need to get younger, but Al Horford's still a very good player. I just hope he stays. I think $6 million player option, I think that's pretty valuable deal for the Warriors. So nothing really to be said there apart from I hope Al stays. Obviously, he could opt out, potentially go to a team that is more in contender mode and closer to contention than what the Warriors can consider to be right now. Maybe he retires. I don't think he's going to retire. I think it's either he stays at the Warriors, picks up that option, or moves on to a different team who's, again, closer to championship contention. Kristaps Porzingis, his former Boston Celtics championship teammate, 50%. We've got a range of players here who who Friedel put at 50% chance of remaining. Porzingis at 50%. I spoke last episode about the sign and trade problem, which to me, again, is why I would probably have him at closer to like 60%, because I just don't see a team giving him a 3-year contract. Simple as that. The 3-year contract is required for a sign and trade to take place. I don't think that's going to happen. The more likely aspect, I would say, is the Warriors give him a 1-year inflated deal at 20 to 25 million to remain rather than just letting him walk in free agency, because I think that would be a disaster. And then you see how it goes. If things aren't going well, then once he becomes trade eligible, you've got an inflated expiring salary there that you could attach assets to and move him on for another piece. That's how I would play it if I was the Warriors, which means it's probably more likely than not, in my opinion, that Kristaps Porzingis remains with the franchise, albeit I see the reasoning for moving on and, again, trying to get a little bit younger and, more importantly, trying to get more availability into the roster. Anthony Melton at 50%. Tim Kawakami, the San Francisco Standard, wrote the other day, the Warriors won't be too high if D'Anthony Melton opts out of his player option for next season. I assume he's going to do that, $3.5 million player option. I'm surprised that Friedel has this at 50%. I would say it's more like 20% chance of D'Anthony Melton staying. Maybe his poor finish to last season, which must be said was attributed to a bit of a thumb injury, so I want to give him some credit for playing through that. But maybe his disappointing form to close the season and lack of impact brings his price down to a low enough number where the Warriors are actually willing to match that. But I don't think the Warriors are going to want to go more than basically $10 million for this guy, max, absolute max $10 million a year annually. And I think if I'm D'Anthony Melton, he's yet to really, the biggest contract he's made was that 1 year, $12.5 million deal that he was basically on with the Warriors going back to the previous season, where obviously tore his ACL. That's from an annual standpoint. That's the biggest contract of his career. He's 27 years old. I have absolutely no problems with him trying to go out and get the best possible offer he can. And I think ultimately a team will be willing to give him maybe in excess of $10 million a year, maybe around that $12, $13 million a year mark. And I don't think the Warriors are going to match that. I don't think the Warriors are going to be willing to go to that level, even if they've got the non-taxpayer middle-level exception available to them. So ultimately, I think the gap between what Melton wants and his desire for a payday and what the Warriors are willing to give is going to be too big of a gap for a reunion to happen in free agency, assuming, again, that he does opt out of that player option. A couple other guys here at 50%. Gary Payton II, probably about right. I could see GP2 returning, but he could also be a victim of this desire to get younger, because if you've got Porzingis staying, you've got Horford staying, and Draymond and Jimmy and staying, and obviously Steph staying, you're just going to have an old roster anyway. And therefore, some of these guys on the periphery probably have to depart if you want to get your first round pick in, and maybe a couple of guys Slater's spoken about mid-prime, guys between, I looked it up yesterday, the Warriors had 5 guys aged between 26 and 30, right bang in the middle of their career on this roster last season. Of those 5 guys, Melton was coming off a torn ACL and had been managed most of the season. And the other guys were Malavai Leones, Nate Williams on 2-way contracts, Pat Spencer, who started on a 2-way contract, and Omer Yurtseven, who was on a pair of 10 days. So the Warriors had basically essentially no one who was good between the age of 26 and 30. So I wonder if a guy like Gary Payton II I think he's played himself into another NBA contract. Earlier in the season, I was wondering, is Gary Payton II going to be in the NBA moving forward after this? He certainly had a really, really good back half of the season, took advantage of more opportunity, obviously, with Golden State's injury issues, had a really healthy season. I think he played 73 games or something. So had a really healthy season from his individual standpoint. And therefore, he's going to get another deal somewhere. Is he going to get more than the minimum? I think if the Warriors offer the minimum, GP2 will come back on that. But maybe the Warriors say, look, mate, ideally we'd like to keep you, but just the age demographic of this roster means we have to move on and get someone younger here. So we'll wait and see what happens with GP2, because that's a really interesting one to me. Malavai Leones at 50%. Look, showed some promising signs early after signing that 2-way contract and in his first initial opportunity. But man, again, not to be disrespectful, but at times looked like a chicken with his head cut off out on the floor over the final months of the season. I think there's going to be better prospects to go and grab on a two-way contract, and therefore I'd like to move on. I'd like to think he's probably closer to 10, 20% to return next season. Again, he's eligible for a two-way contract, so I'm not going to be absolutely up in arms, disgusted if he comes back, because he's probably not going to play much of a role next season anyway, because fingers crossed the Warriors are healthy, and if they're not healthy and Leonis has to play, they're kind of cooked anyway. I would like to think there's a better prospect out there that they can utilize on a two-way contract. Friedel also has LJ Cryer at 50%. This should be closer to 90% because LJ Cryer is a guy that I think the Warriors could use occasionally as like a bucket getter. Like, this roster lacks guys who can make shots off the dribble, right? Like real shot makers. And LJ Cryer is that. And again, he's eligible on a two-way contract. Just keep him on a two-way deal. Okay. The only reason LJ Cryer shouldn't be on this roster next season, honestly, is if another team comes calling with a guaranteed standard contract on the main roster. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think he's good enough for that necessarily, but he's more than good enough for a two-way contract. And therefore, he should be, like, to me, he should be a 90% chance of staying. And that 10% gap for a random team says, yeah, here's a standard rookie contract or whatever, and you can be on our main roster. So I would be staggered if the Warriors moved on from him and he was either out of the league or on a two-way contract elsewhere next season. A couple of guys here who Friedel has at 40% and 30% respectively to remain with the franchise, who the Warriors just should be moving on from. Like, there's no world to me in which these two guys should be on the roster. Starting with Pat Spencer, who Friedel has at 40%. Look, Pat Spencer's been a great story for the Warriors. You know, his lacrosse background had some really impactful moments for the Warriors this season. Had a couple of games, I think, back in December against like Philly and Cleveland where he was absolutely huge. And I think he kind of helped them win the game in Cleveland, nearly won them the game if they didn't choke it in Philadelphia. Really cool story. But the Warriors aren't about, like, this isn't a league in which you can just benefit off a cool story, right? Like, you've got to be a good, talented player. And I just think there's too many limitations in Pat Spencer's game. And I think the league is deep and talented enough for the Warriors to just go and get an upgrade at a backup point guard spot. And so Pat Spencer, to me, fantastic story. You are actually eligible for a two-way contract again next season. I struggle to see a world in which a player goes from a two-way contract to the main roster, back to a two-way contract, back to the main roster, and then back to a two-way contract for a third time. I don't see that happening. It is possible because he's only had 3 years in the league. But to me, cool story, but that doesn't get you a long-term NBA future, right? And I just think there's enough options out there for the Warriors to go and grab someone else, someone more proven, someone more experienced. Like, the dude still only played like 100 NBA games. He is 29 years old, but he's still fairly inexperienced. I just think there's someone else out there. And if you're not going to go the experience route, maybe there's a young guy. Maybe you take a young guard with the 11th overall pick, right? If someone falls to you out of that, that guard range that many expect, kind of the 5 to 10 range of the draft to be filled with guard. Maybe someone falls to you at 11 or something like that, and you get like a backup point guard there who you can develop for the future, who's going to have far greater upside than Pat Spencer. So when I read, 40% chance of Pat Spencer staying on this roster, I don't like that. I think it should be closer to 10%, to be honest. And that 10% probably is if he's eligible, not eligible, but willing to come back on a two-way contract, which would be a bit of a slap in the face, but that's better than not being on a roster at all, I suppose, if you're Pat Spencer. And then Seth Curry at 30%. When healthy, the dude can still play and can still be a valuable rotation player. He shot like 48% from three-point range this past season. Fantastic. Cool. The dude played 10 games. 10 games and less than 135 total minutes. He's 35 years old. You think these it can't get any worse, I suppose, from an injury health standpoint. But do you think it's going to get drastically better? And I don't think he's good enough to be willing to take the risk on him again, right? Maybe there's another veteran contender out there who needs, he's still an elite shooter, don't get me wrong. Maybe there's a veteran contender out there who's willing to take the risk and he's in a better position to take the risk on his health and body, I suppose, at this point of his career. But the Warriors, again, in need of younger legs. Well, you can't have Porzingis and Horford and Steph and Jimmy and Draymond and maybe like GP2, I think, is more worthwhile bringing back than Seth Curry, given what they respectively did this season. So therefore, like, you can't then add Seth Curry to all those guys on top of that, while also retaining the desire to get younger. You're just not in that situation. So therefore, like 30% for Seth Curry, like 5% chance. Right. And that's if like some drastic things happen on the roster where you all of a sudden really need shooting. And the Warriors do need shooting. They rank 20th in 3-point percentage this season, but like do it elsewhere out of younger options. Not a dude who played less than 135 total minutes on the season, who's 35 years old. And like sciatica injury, like that's a back issue, nerve issue. Doesn't really fill me with optimism of that dude playing a lot moving forward. Couple of guys here at 20%. Nate Williams, I would have him more at like 5% as well. I just do not see him coming back because he's not eligible for a two-way contract. If he was eligible for a two-way deal, sure, right? Like I think he can play in a pinch here and there for the Warriors, particularly when stars are resting on some given nights and whatever else. Like he actually showed some positive signs for the Warriors this season. But I don't think he's in that middle range, a little bit like Cryer, I suppose, where you're not going to use a main roster spot on him, but he's very good for a two-way contract. The difference is Cryer is eligible for a two-way contract and Williams isn't. And so I just don't think the Warriors are going to be in a position where they're willing to give that dude a main roster spot. I just do not see that whatsoever. So to me, he's at like 5% chance of returning to the franchise. Charles Bassey, 20% as well. See, I don't understand how you can have Spencer at 40 and Curry at 30 and have Charles Bassey below that, because the Warriors need a guy like Charles Bassey. And, recorded a couple of double-doubles, put up some big numbers in the final 5 games of the regular season. I think particularly if they bring back Horford and Porzingis, they need a dude like that who can be a little bit of a point of difference, long, athletic guy, obviously much younger, much less injury-prone, that kind of thing. And just go out there and eat up some center minutes occasionally and potentially play some double big lineups with Horford and Porzingis and Bassey and that combination to try and lessen the burden on that veteran duo. So they need someone like Bassey. Whether he is Bassey or not in particular, I don't know. Maybe there's another younger, higher upside option. Maybe there's another more proven option who's still only 25 to 30 years old out there who's gettable in free agency. So I'm not saying that Charles Bassey is a guarantee to return to the franchise, but they do need a player like him. And therefore, I think he should be at like that Pat Spencer 40% range, as opposed to, I just cannot fathom how Curry and Spencer would be above Bassey in terms of probability to return to the Warriors next season. You've got Quinton Post at 15% chance of returning to the Golden State Warriors next season, according to Nick Friedel. I think we've gone too far on this. I honestly think we've gone too far in regard to our view on Quinton Post, who I still think has a legitimate NBA future. Now, I might be in the minority on this, but when I read this and saw him as the lowest, like of all the players here, including Pat Spencer and Seth Curry and Nate Williams and Charles Bassey, of all the players here, LJ Cryer, Malachi Leones, of every single Warrior player, and Nick Friedel had Quinton Post as the least likely to return to the franchise next season, I was shocked by that, to be honest, because, again, I think this dude has more of an NBA future than other guys that we saw play for the Warriors over the past few months of this season. And you've also got a world in which, like, Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis, even if they do return, you're going to have to, like, there's a world in which the Warriors could still have, like, 4 centers entering next season, where it's like Porzingis, Horford, Bassey, and Post, or something like that. Because Horford and Porzingis are going to play, like, 50 games max, hopefully. They're going to rest back-to-backs. They really should only be playing, like, 20 minutes a game max. Maybe Porzingis gets up to 25 occasionally. So I think Quinton Post still has value, not just to the Warriors, but around the league. And I feel like we've got too low on him as a guy going forward because of what was a very underwhelming and disappointing second year. I'm happy to acknowledge that. He was very disappointing, showed some promising signs early with some improvement in his interior defense. But beyond that, was pretty poor, you'd have to say. The three-point shooting fell off a cliff. A team high 40.8% his rookie year fell to 33.6%. And that's going to be the biggest thing for him, because if he's not an elite three-point shooter for a 7-footer, then yeah, he's not going to last in the league very long. But if I'm the Warriors and I was a rival team potentially looking at him as a restricted free agent this offseason, I would say that we should believe in his three-point shooting. Okay, because if you go back to his last two collegiate seasons, he shot 43.1 and 42.6% from three-point range. So technically, yes, across college and in the NBA, but he shot at least 40.8% from three in 3 of the past 4 seasons. So I'm actually taking this season at 33.6% as the outlier here. And I think there is a way in which he can just basically getting his confidence back is the main thing to me. Getting his confidence back where he's not hesitating on some of these threes, where he's taking them in rhythm. Like, he had a game later in the season against the Knicks in Madison Square Garden where he had a career high 22 points, hit a few threes, looked really good. That was one of his last games because then he got injured after that. I just feel like with the injury and the underwhelming second season, we're getting too low on this guy. When we've got to remember, he had a really impressive rookie season, shot 40.8% from beyond the arc. His three-point shooting going back to his last 2 years in college was elite. I'm buying into that. And particularly, I think if you've got a 7-footer who can space the floor effectively and shoot 40% from three, that's really valuable in today's NBA. And particularly if you're getting a guy on a really cheap contract. Like, we're talking about the Warriors moving on from this guy. I don't think there's going to be a team out there that's going to give him more than like $3 or $4 million a year. Like, if you just bring him back on like, I don't know, $2 or $3 million, like, you can't really go wrong with that, I wouldn't have thought. So to me, Quinton Post being at 15% chance of returning, that's ridiculous to me. I would have that more at 50-50, to be honest. And if anything, perhaps more likely than not. I don't know. Let me know what your thoughts are on Quinton Post specifically, because 15% I thought was just drastically way too low. And I think we've got, as a fan base, as analysts, we've got too low on him as a guy moving forward. Now, I'm not saying he's going to have a long-term NBA future, but I would be taking the risk. I would be taking a gamble on his three-point shooting returning to 40%, because, again, he's done that in 3 of the past 4 years. So let me know what you make of my thoughts on this, what you make of Nick Friedell's thoughts on this when it comes to every Warrior player and their chances of returning to the franchise next season. I'm going to finish up there. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that'd be greatly appreciated. Follow me at POK252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. And I'm off to watch Game 2 of the Eastern Conference Finals between the Cleveland Cavaliers and New York Knicks.